Welcome to Red Badger offices and to React Native for Beginners. I'm sure you're not all beginners though. So very welcome to you all. There's make yourself at home. There's more pizza coming, and there's lots of beer. So we'll have a break in between the second and third talks, so you can have enjoy some time to socialise and to eat more beer and eat more pizza and beer. Thank you to the speakers. We've got Joe and Jamie and Zara. I've got some announcements to make. I have to do that. Sorry. Can I advance on to the next slide?
Yeah, the next arrow should do it.
Otherwise, I'll forget. Hashtag React London. So this is like a little side meetup on main React meetups. The next React meetup is on the 29th of May at Facebook offices. We're hiring, I have to say that. Otherwise it gets sacked even though it's my company. And if anybody would like to speak at one of the React meetups or one of these, then please get in touch. Becca is at the back, wave your hand, Becca. Or come and see me or anybody, because we're always looking for speakers, and it'd be really good it's a good opportunity to practice your speaking skills. We've got a new meetup that we're running alongside the React ones called We Love Tech. We ran one about 6 weeks ago on We Love Peer-to-Peer Web, and we had Paul Frazee come over from Austin, Texas, to talk about that, and he's the guy behind the Beaker browser. And the next We Love Tech meetup is on the 31st of May. It's all about accessibility. Flying down one of our ex-employees from Scotland, Hoppo. Nobody knows him. He's a great character. He's going to be doing a talk on that. So if anybody wants to come, you're more than welcome. We're going to have some drinks afterwards at the pub just down there called the Angel. And have I said everything? I think I have. Oh, yeah. So, yeah, let's get going. Joe, over to you.
Thank you. So, hi everyone, I'm Joe. It's nice to be here. And this is me. This is my Twitter header, which is a portrait of Vladimir Putin, which I photoshopped my head on top of. And then that's my face where I have to open up Xcode. And so I'm a student at Reading University. I study computer science. I'm in my placement year at the moment between second and third year. And during that placement year, I'm working at Fluid, which is an all-in-one collaboration platform for businesses. And I'm the lead mobile developer, and lead is in quotes because I'm the only mobile developer. So I'm not sure where that really leaves me, but anyway, this is React Native. So what is React Native? According to Facebook, React Native is an open source cross-platform solution. It was created by Facebook, and it is a way of making real native applications using JavaScript, using React concepts. So what do I mean by all these things? React Native, by real application, what I mean is that React Native is not a web view which has a wrapper which has access to native methods. It is actually a native application. It uses native components from the actual SDKs itself. So in theory, it should be indiscernible from an application that was written in Objective-C or Java. As I mentioned, it uses JavaScript, whether or not you like JavaScript. If you're here, you probably do, or maybe you don't. And that includes everything about JavaScript, good and bad. And you can also transpile to JavaScript using TypeScript. Flow comes out of the box, and things like Reason can offer you 100% type soundness with JavaScript. So that's React Native. So when React Native came out, a lot of people started saying this concept of write once, run everywhere existed. And that's what people were assuming was the goal of React Native, but it's actually not. What Facebook actually has said from the beginning is that React Native is a learn once, write everywhere framework. And so what do they mean by that? They mean that if you learn the concepts behind React, the lifecycle methods, then in theory you can apply that to not just things like the web with React.js, but also native applications like React Native, VR applications, and there's a little list a little bit later explaining some other platforms. And so with React Native at Fluid, our app was from the start written in React Native. And every time I have to make a feature change or a bug fix, I estimate it's about 95% code sharing between platforms. I tend to test it on iOS and then forget that I need to test it on Android, push it, and then it will crash. So you got to, that 5% is usually an Android-related error, which I will get into in a little bit later. So these are some features I'm just going to run through of React Native that you get. Hot reloading, things like just changing the color of a button does not mean that you need to rerun the whole application. You just can save your project, and hopefully in the packager, it will reload and you see your change reflected and all your state should be kept intact, which is much nicer than doing an Xcode build every time that you change a font size. React Native also gives you this idea of piecemeal integration where you can take a native app and inside the actual Facebook app, in the events page, that is a React Native page. So it's not just this idea of you can put a React Native page inside a native app, but what you could also do is put native things inside a React Native app. So it kind of works both ways around. UI layout in React Native is handled by Flexbox, which if you know the web, then you hopefully are quite comfortable with Flexbox. It tends to be as much Flexbox as the web is, but sometimes it's a little bit lacking behind. They only just recently added space evenly, for example, in Justify content. So I'll also mention how CSS is handled styling with React as well in a little bit. The React Native community is also very good. I know it's not necessarily a feature, but I tend to find it's quite welcoming to new people. When I was starting out about a year ago now, I think there was a lot of really good content out there, some Medium articles and stuff. And on my last slide, there's some places that you can find useful information. So developer experience before React Native, if you wanted an iOS and Android app, then you have multiple code bases, which require multiple skill sets, either Swift, Objective-C, Java, Kotlin, and even those, Kotlin is fairly new, Swift is slightly less new, but those things are necessary if you wanted to do a native application before React Native, unless you wanted to do Xamarin, but I won't mention that. So tool chain as well. With native development, you have Xcode, which is its own thing that you have to manage, and Android Studio, where Google somehow took IntelliJ and made it slow. But so tooling in native wasn't so good. And also just the fact that big development teams, places like Deliveroo, for example, which are completely application-based, would need multiple large departments just to handle their native implementation for applications. So you could do this, or you could just have one application and get reviews like this on the App Store, well, on the Google Play Store, for example, where people don't like your application because you're not on iOS, and they borrow someone's phone to rate you poorly. So please don't do this, for the record. So now React Native has come about, and its life is better. You have one code base, more or less, depending on if you want to go specifically for platforms. So what you can do is you can specifically write, I want to do a .android.js file, and with that you could say, this is where all my Android logic goes, and the packager knows the correct way to navigate those kinds of situations. And also I mentioned more or less because you could also base a web code base off of your React Native one, or vice versa. It's a single reusable skill set. Like I mentioned, web applications can be written in React. The paradigms are extremely, well, they are the same as React Native, so that's very nice to get. Any editor you want, any tooling you want, it's JavaScript. Use VS Code, which is what I use. Microsoft has really good tooling for React Native because Skype, the new Skype app is built in React Native. I don't know if people know that, but So VS Code is really good. Nucleus is very good. That's what Facebook uses internally. And then you just have like your general IDEs, WebStorm, things like that. And this lost point one team across multiple platforms. So that's kind of me. I manage the iOS and Android applications on my own. New features, bug fixes. I don't have to go and code some Swift or go today. Okay, today I'm going to code some Swift. Today I'm going to code some Java. I just write it in JavaScript and goes across. And then you also have this library from Sarah Vieira points out that there is a whole load of platforms that React can just plug into. And you can't expect that your React Native code works directly across, but there is a lot of shared logic, especially business logic, that can be transferred to things like VR applications. And there is a whole bunch of really cool ones. You can make presentations in React, and yeah, so that's worth checking out. So this is something not so good about React Native is the error messages are quite unfortunate. They don't tend to be too descriptive, and I mean, give it credit. Sometimes you do get one that says exactly what's wrong, but you may notice that 3 of these are Android error messages. That's not that I'm biased, but so the one on the far left is a Android specific one, which happens if you leave a trailing space that isn't inside a text view. Android doesn't like that. iOS is totally fine with it. You won't get a crash on iOS, but on Android that will cause an issue. And that's a hard one to find as well. You've left a space somewhere. The second one is a native issue. Invariant violation is a bit nondescript, but it happens, or it used to happen, I think it's been fixed now, when you animate the opacity of an element. This was happening. And to give it credit, I know I've hid it behind that other error message, but it is actually giving a stack trace, which is pretty helpful. This third one's my favorite. I see this one quite regularly. It happens when I think what happens is that your service worker breaks and it says this import scripts error. And to me, I've just translated that in my head now to mean I'll just turn the debugger off and then it'll show you what the actual error is. It's a bit of a non-error. And that last one is just because React Native uses a bridge in order to communicate to the native platforms. That last one is saying there's some sort of problem with bridge, so just restart it and hopefully you'll be okay. If you're not, then try clearing the cache in it. So, some misconceptions about React Native. These come from back when it came out. Navigation is bad. This came about because there was a native implementation for navigation. However, it was specifically on iOS at the start. Then there was an experimental one, but it kind of got abandoned and now it's deprecated. And so this turns a lot of people off because it's a huge part of an application. Nowadays, it's not so bad. You have React Navigation, which is a really well-maintained project coming up to version 2 now. And it's being worked on a lot by the people at Expo who have a vested interest in React Navigation. And I'll mention them a bit more in a little bit. There's also a native navigation solution. So React Navigation is JavaScript purely. So that's Expo can use it. And a native solution actually uses the native navigators. So you can expect that to be, in general, a bit more performant. So another misconception that came around, this one used to be true anyway. Every release was a breaking change. There used to be breaking changes every 2 weeks. The React Native schedule was at the start, which is quite intense if you're trying to maintain a production application. This isn't true anymore. It's not so bad. The upgrade process got a lot better around the 0.4x's version. React Native is not a 1.0 framework. You are still using something that is quote-unquote beta. But it is significantly better now. You will see much less breaking changes, and they will not affect 100% of the developers. It will just be a small subset of people using specific modules, etc. And so the final misconception is one that's not just about React Native. It can be applied to any cross-platform framework, which is that making a native UI it's not possible. You have to use native code in order to make a native UI. So I took this, I expanded this misconception, and I found this online. Someone's article just weighing up pros and cons of React Native, and he mentions this, which I found interesting. React Native isn't per se replacing native look and feel, but it is native look and feel. It uses the native button. It uses the native view. So using this, I thought I would play a little game. I know everyone loves audience participation, so we're going to evaluate 4 applications, and I want people to just raise their hands for each one if they think one is native. So is Stack Overflow a native application? Who thinks it is? One person? 2 people? 2? Okay. Is Gitpoint a native application? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. A countable amount. So 7. More people think Gitpoint is native. Okay. Is Airbnb a native application? Okay, people know this one. I thought they might, but is Parkopedia, if people know Parkopedia, is that a native application? No one? 1 person. Great. So the answer is Stack Overflow is actually a native application, which is disappointing. It's not a very good one. Gitpoint is React Native, and it works really nicely. Airbnb, obviously React Native. It's one of the most famous examples. I thought I would include it anyway. And Parkopedia is a native application. But this wasn't just a survey to determine, you can't tell. The point is to say that you can design a UI however you want. It's really up to the developer how native the look and feel of an application is. And so you can see, both of these applications have tab bars. They try and stick to the native concepts. The navigation headers are very, very similar. You got a floating action button on Stack Overflow, but that can be recreated in JavaScript pretty easily. And with these 2, it's more of an example of you can take your own custom UI and just make it look good. So Airbnb obviously put a load of work into their React Native application. They've been pushing it since it came about. And both of these applications have their own custom UI where you don't really need to look and feel native. You can just do whatever you want. So how do you get started writing React Native if you haven't already? These are 2 ways I'm going to show you. There are more ways, and obviously you have the option of integrating React Native into an already existing application. The React Native CLI is Facebook's original way of installing React Native to your machine. And Create React Native App is it's supposed to be an equivalence of Create React App, but for React Native. I will get into details and differences between both of them. I just wanted to show some input and output. So here is what happens when you run React Native init, just a project name, and this is some nice output you get. Pretty simple, basic. You just run iOS, that will start the packager for you, or you go inside Xcode and run, that also starts the packager. And Android, you run Android, and then if you don't have the emulator running, then it will give you an error saying you need the emulator running. So either plug in your phone or have that going. That takes 41 seconds, which I will get back to why that's relevant later. So Create React Native App, you run the project name, and you get much nicer output, a bit more beginner friendly, and it explains all the different scripts inside. It uses Yarn. There's an NPM issue with Create React App and Create React Native App, so they recommend that you use Yarn. And so Create React Native App uses Expo, which offers a lot more native modules out of the box, things like video, which isn't supported out of the box from React Native. You get push notification support, some crash reporting with Sentry has an SDK. Even the Facebook SDK is on Expo, but it's not out of the box React Native. So Expo gives you a lot of benefits, and it also provides a much easier way of getting started with your actual real phone. You scan a QR code on Android. You used to be able to on iOS, but Apple don't like it anymore. So the iOS people, now you have to receive a text message, and it will run and build, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second. This takes 1 minute and 8 seconds. I just wanted to point this out to say that you're not getting the most trimmed down version. You're getting something on top of this, and with Expo, you also do get a downside where if you wanted to use a native module that isn't supported out of the box, then you have to eject, which involves either some pain or not, depending on how many Expo modules you're trying to use. But it essentially takes your Expo project, turns it into a React Native project with your iOS and Android endpoints. And yeah, that's Expo eject means that you can install a native module you can't usually in Expo. So some React Native code. It's very similar to React if you've used React, which most people here have, I assume. You have your view instead of a div. You have your text instead of a span. And your styles are just JavaScript JSON objects with just a CSS equivalence with property names and values. I use the style sheet API from React Native. It gives you a performance. It does a bit more performance improvements than just doing an inline style. You can do an inline style. So that's React Native. And React code. So this is what happens when you run create React app. The previous slide is create React Native code. So, sorry, create React Native app code. This is what you get out of the box when you run create React Native app. And this is what you get when you run create React app. And it's a bit, there's a bit more to it. You have a header section, you have an image which spins because it's an SVG, and you have a title and some code formatting inside the p tag. So you may think that it's potentially not an equivalence for a starting point. So what I did was I just took that code from Create React app and I translated it over to React Native. So quite literally, the DOM elements that represent views have transformed into DOM elements that represent an area have been transformed into views. And I had to get funky with the image because SVG support didn't come out of the box with React Native. So I'm just doing a PNG and I'm animating the animated one, which Jamie is going to talk about in a bit. And the styles, you can see that you can add multiple styles, and that's actually how the animation works. And then I've got text. The view at the top represents a header area. And I didn't do the code formatting, but you could do that by importing a new font style. So that's the way I think I would do it. And there's an inline style there as well, because that's totally fine. So this is so similar to the React code earlier. Why not just use this and try and make it work on web, which is what someone at Twitter, Nicholas Gallagher, did. He made a library called React Native Web, which sounds a bit ridiculous because the whole point of React Native is to take React and do it natively. Why are you doing it the other way around? But it actually does make a lot of sense because React Native comes with a lot of things that when you do web projects, you have to add separately. For one, you have to use CSS, and with React Native, you don't. You just learn the JavaScript object. And if you do the wrong CSS in JavaScript, even though it's a string, it will tell you inside the package what the correct options are for that part. So the React Native web looks like this, actually. Actually, it is this. This is React Native web code. And this is from my React Native web starter library. You can just get running with it. This compiles for web and for native apps. So it uses create React Native app for native and create React app for web. So what does that look like? This is me making a change to the word hello. And you can see that I saved my file in a different window. It compiles the change. It happened on iPhone X there first, and then it goes to the Firefox tab in the background. And this, on the left, I just want to emphasize that that is actually a native application. It is not a website being run inside a browser. So that it works really well, and I encourage checking it out. My library has a TypeScript branch, navigation branch, including native navigation. So if the important animations that you get that you're used to in your native applications, you can have that, and the normal React router API that you're used to with React. So that's quite nice. And so this goes to the whole idea of, well, React doesn't need these two separate entities. You need React JS and React Native. If it's learn once, write anywhere, you shouldn't need to learn two pretty similar things and write it anywhere. And in the replies, you can see the React framework itself replied saying, that they can't fault Paul Young's logic here. And then you have a reply from this guy, Shift Reduce Conflict. This is John and Walk, who invented React, saying that's kind of the plan. And it should have pluggable rendering backends, which it is getting to. If you look at that repo that I addressed earlier with the awesome React platform, then you'll see where that can be applied to. So just to sum up, React Native is native, cross-platform, JavaScript, React, and it's millennial speak good. So thank you very much. That's a link to the slides. These are some resources I thought were pretty good, and I use them as well. And that's my social information if anyone wants to stalk me. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joe. That was brilliant. Has anybody got any questions? Do you want to take questions?
Yeah, sure.
Has anyone got any questions for Joe?
Hello.
Hello. Yeah, so a lot of the appeal, obviously, especially to the management kind of team, would be you only really need one set of developers to create it up. From what I've heard, occasionally it ends up needing three, where you need a React developer, Android developer, and an iOS developer.
Yeah.
Obviously, in your company, that's probably not the case, but do you foresee that being an issue?
It really does depend on what type of application you're making. So, for example, I was reading a blog post on the Twitch Medium page where they were talking about how they wanted to implement all of the Twitch features with React Native. And he was an Android engineer, and he was talking about how he was finding he had to go back into Android code more often than not. And so with Twitch, you have all these native things like a live stream and a live chat component, which maybe are more suited to a native app developer. So it depends on your project a lot. So for Fluid, it's a lot of API requests and data to read. There's a chat, but it's fairly simple to implement, Signal, Stream, etc. So it really does depend on your project.
Great. Anybody else? Any other questions? No.
I think someone at the back may have had a question.
Sorry.
I'm running Linux, so no Xcode for me. Thank you. I'm running Linux, so no Xcode for me. When I try to build things in React Native, there's this huge long build process, which is fine because I've got a computer that builds it for me. But somewhere along the line, the computer tends to get stuck on something, and then I end up with build errors from Gradle in Java, which I know nothing about. Is that just always going to happen? Is there any way around that?
So is that when you're initiating a project from the start?
Well, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So in terms of the long build time, that usually happens when it's the first time that you're running the project or something similar to that. It can go on for quite a while, more than 2 minutes even. But after that, it should build a lot faster, especially on Android. I find Android tends to be faster at building than Xcode. With Gradle issues, though, I guess it really depends on what the Gradle issue is. I've had like multi-dex issues where you have to go in and change the manifest, and that's just a case of me going on Stack Overflow every time I see one of those and seeing if I can fix it. But on Linux, it should be fine.
Is there any difference in the speed of the app running afterwards?
So you mean compared to a native application? So for speed, there is a minor. It actually depends. There's a very thorough article, which maybe I should have included here, but it goes into an evaluation between different areas, different types of applications, so like signing into a Facebook page and making a to-do list. And in certain areas, React Native perform better than native, and in certain areas, native perform better than React Native. So it like I said earlier, it depends. GPU-intensive tasks seem to perform better natively, and then things like making a to-do list item and updating UI tended to perform frames per second better on React Native. So it does depend how you use React Native, though, because you can write the code badly and then it performs slowly. So.
And is there a difference in the size of the app that at the end of it?
Yes, there is actually. It's a good question. With Android, there is no JavaScript engine that can compile your React Native code. So actually every React Native app needs to come bundled with this JavaScript core. And that does increase the APK size. I think if you do a React Native init project, then I think it comes out about 6 megabytes. I could be wrong. But then you've got things like ProGuard to minify your application, which hopefully reduces it quite a bit. And Fluid is about 30 megabytes, and that's a full production app that we use. And it's quite a lot of pages. iOS, you don't have that problem because JavaScript core is bundled inside the. It's a part of the native SDK. So, yeah, that it.
Great. Thank you very much.
Cool.
Brilliant. Thanks, Joe. We're going to have a couple of minutes while we switch over laptops and stuff, and then Jamie's going to talk, and then we'll have a break.
Yeah, no problem. Getting you all clear. It's in my other pocket.
That's exactly it. So, I didn't see it. I was just like, I'm good. How are you? Oh yeah. What kind of roles do you apply for? No, I use like
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Thank you. I think so. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Is this? Okay, guys and girls, we're ready to go again. Thank you very much for your patience. Jamie, over to you.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about animations in React Native. I've now thought of a better title for this talk. So it's Animations in React Native, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Native UX. My name is Jamie. This is me. I exist under my full name on the internet on GitHub and my almost never used Twitter, and I work for Tech Will Save Us, and we make toys that kids can build and code themselves, kind of STEM toys, tech toys, stuff like this, and we have a digital experience that goes alongside our physical product, and that's what I work on, and a part of that is some React Native apps. And I'm going to start by picking up on something that Joe was talking about, and that's about what makes a native app feel native, and how does React Native fit into that? And so I was thinking about the kind of things that mean, why would we use a native app over just making a website? And I thought like maybe one reason is we want offline capabilities. Up until very recently, we haven't been able to do anything offline with a website. And so if we wanted that, we'd need a native app. Or maybe if we wanted to use some device hardware like Bluetooth or the camera or something like this, again, up until very recently, you just couldn't do this with web. And even now, it's very flaky and only works in Chrome. And then another one I was thinking a bit more of a kind of philosophical difference is that a native app knows what it looks like before it's fetched any data from anywhere. The layout is baked in. And on web, everything, every single byte that we see has to be fetched from a server somewhere. And then I started thinking about how we use native apps. And so, for example, you get gestures on a native app, and you don't tend to see gestures so much on web. Maybe you have something swipeable, but it's kind of unusual, and it's pretty hard to get touch stuff right. And in the same vein, maybe it's animations. Animations on web are really quite difficult. We can do CSS animations, but anything more complex or more interactive than that, you don't really see very often. And I think it's these last two that I'm really interested in, because these aren't kind of factual differences, but they're differences in how we experience a native app. And certainly before I came to hybrid app development, I know there was a reputation for hybrid apps having a bad feel. Maybe they would have all of the elements that a native app would have, but they would just feel kind of clunky and not right, and there would be something about them that wouldn't have the weight that maybe a native app would have. And so I think it's a really fair question to ask that, is this where React Native falls down? You've got all the components that you might want, but maybe the feel that you get, the performance could be great, but just that way that you interact with it might not be as good. And I think absolutely not. React Native's key achievement over any other hybrid app development framework that I've seen is that this kind of thing, gestures, interactions, and animations, can be really easily achieved at a really, really high level. And I think actually a lot of the reason that there's this bad rap for hybrid apps is because of how we come to them. I was a web developer who got hired by a company that wanted to make a React Native app, and none of us had any idea what we were doing when we started. And we started making it like web developers. And web developers might be really good at a CSS hover animation, but any interaction more complicated than that, we just don't really know how to do it. Whereas native developers, on the other hand, they have these really heavy-duty APIs that come with the tools that they're using. And more importantly, I think they have a cultural expectation in that Google's material design guidelines and Apple's human interface guidelines spend a lot of time talking about the importance of gestures and interactions and touch. And where you come to React Native, and the docs are great, but there's nobody telling you that this is how you should be doing things. And so I really want to impress this idea that animation in native apps, whether they're React Native or not, is not a luxury. And I'm not saying that in that I think you have to do them, you have to suffer for them because they're essential. They're not a luxury because they're actually really easy when you're using React Native. And you can get an app that feels really good through the tools that you're given without very much work. And now I'm just going to kind of go through how you might build up some basic animations in React Native. And so you start with something very similar to what Joe showed us. It's just a really simple screen that renders an alien in this case. A view is like a div, as he said, text is like a span. This is pretty straightforward. And now we can start and think about how you might animate this. And then the core of animations in React Native are these objects called animated values. These kind of perform a bit of magic in that they can bind to the underlying variables in native views and change them directly. So the performance problems that you would get if you were changing JavaScript variables that were then having to go through Facebook's bridge code and then back out, 100 times a second, you don't have to deal with that with animated values because they can kind of bypass this bridge mechanism that Facebook provide. And so we start off with our animation. We just put an animated value in the state and give it an initial value of 0. And then we want to hook that up to what we've got. And all we do there is we swap out the view we're using with an animated view, which is just a view that can take advantage of these optimizations that I've mentioned. And then we define a style. Styles Joe touched on, they're a little bit weird when you first look at them in React Native, but they're pretty easy. Transforms are a little bit strange. You give them an array of objects that define the transformations. But styles in React Native, I think there's an almost perfect oversimplification. And pretty much every day when I'm working on React Native, I'll guess at something and it'll be wrong and I'll get an error. But that wrongness comes from when this is wrong, which is very, very rare. And you just use CSS properties and you make them camel cased, and you can only use Flexbox. And maybe one of the best things as a web dev coming to React Native is that you don't have to worry about Internet Explorer compatibility. You can always use Flexbox and it always works exactly how you want it to. So going back to the React Native code, I've just added a button in because we need something to start the animation off. And when this button's pressed, it calls a function on the class that we're in called animate. And this is what that looks like. Where we use another function of React Native's animated API called timing. Timing takes a duration and an end value and an animated value that you want to mutate. That's that. You define that animation and then you start it. So here I've said, let's animate that value from 0, how I initialized it, to 350, and it'll take 800 milliseconds. And that looks something like this. this is very basic. This is not great native UX, but this is a good building block. You'll notice that it is easing. Bizarrely, for reasons I don't understand, Facebook put easing on animations by default. The number of bugs that throws up, I'd be quite interested to know. And so now we've set this up, we can go on to exciting stuff really easily. So for me, when I got into animations, the next question is, this is all very well, but if I have to do that code that I just went through for every value that I want to animate, that's an awful lot of boilerplate. But actually, there's a really nice way around that, and it's something that Facebook, I apologize, the line breaks have gone quite strange there. Facebook have come up with called Interpolate, and if any of your web developers have used D3 before, this is like scales in D3, and here we're saying we're translating Y, moving in vertical direction like we were before, but we also want to move in the X direction, and rather than a whole new animated value, we just say we know that the original value is going between 0 and 350, but we only want to move it between 0 and 200. And that's super easy. And we get diagonal movement. And that's great. We can translate, but we can also use interpolations for other things. So opacity is really easy to achieve. And you can see here that the output range is kind of upside down compared to the input range. But it's fine. It can do that. And you can start to piece these things together with a few animated values and timing functions on them. You can start to build like really quite significant you can really build quite significant UIs, and I'm using the wrong version of the slides, so I am going to have to I apologize. So back to where I was. I've done something wrong. I apologize. There was a video of what you can achieve with these animated values here, but it has disappeared. So you are not going to get to see that. It was extremely impressive, though, I can assure you. But even then, this isn't interaction, and interaction is what I started off talking about. And interaction in React Native, this is something I will concede. I think it's easy, but the API is really terrifying. It uses these things called pan responders, which I think is related to the naming of the underlying native code. I don't really understand what most of the pan responder code means, but you don't really need to. This first bit on start should set pan responder returns true. I have no idea what that means. But on pan responder move is the important bit. It's meaning when the thing is being touched, this function gets called. And then again, a really weird API, this animated event thing. I can't remember what null is replacing there, but the key bit is that on the movement event, we're binding dy, the change in vertical position of the touch, to our animated value. And then the really amazing thing is then this binding our animated value to the touch, we can actually use the same code that we had before and get really satisfying effects. The pan responder gives you a load of props that you can use. Again, you don't have to know what they are. You just spread those onto the component. And then this happens straight away, the same code as before. And we can use the same interpolations as before. We have the opacity effect. And then you can get really interesting, and you can start to see how things would turn into a native app that you might use. So let's say we want something to happen when you let go. So there's another pan responder function on pan responder release. And here I'm using the spring function, which is a sort of vaguely physical spring. I think it's how the chat heads on Facebook Messenger work. And this is just saying when you release, animate this value to 0, behaving like a spring over 250 milliseconds. And this, I really like this example because you can see how this is a bit like pull to refresh, but you can see how this kind of movement would come up in kind of app that you would want to build, and would have that native feel. And there's a pretty huge toolbox of things available. You can stagger animations, you can run them in parallel, you can run them sequentially. There are loads of different easing functions. There are springs. You can decay values to 0. And there's more than this. There's a lot of stuff that basically, if you can think of how you would compose an animation out of these values moving between other values, Facebook will provide you with a function that can do that. And this, I think, potentially is actually the video that I wanted to show you. I just forgot what order it came in. This is a nice example of something that we built at Tech Will Save Us. So we have a product called the Dough Universe, and the Dough Universe comes with an app that kids can, is kind of an interactive manual. And in the Dough Universe, there's an evil character, Dr. Drydough, and he's really angry because he's made of Play-Doh, but he's dried out, so he's no longer conductive. And all of the other dough creatures are having a great time, and they're playing with all this tech because they're conductive. But he can't do any of it, and so he grows up spiteful, and he decides to ruin the Dough Universe and take the tech away from the dough creatures. But you, the owner of our kits, can rescue the universe. And so this is how you might start off. And every animation you see here is built basically using what I just showed you. So and so more on what's after the loading screen later, but I think it's quite fun how much you can get from just springing a few things around makes everything feel a lot more fun. And so, yeah, I just want to touch on what if you want to do stuff that is beyond these basic animations. I have claimed that these helper functions will get you anything you want. I think we probably all know that that's not quite true. What if you want really custom stuff? The designers have made something beautiful in After Effects, and they insist that it needs to look exactly like this. And so there's a tool which I'm a big fan of called Lottie from Airbnb. If you've used Bodymovin on the web before, it's the same. They've now rebranded Bodymovin to Lottie for web. And Lottie takes files from After Effects, and I have no idea how it does it, but it turns those into close to native performance animations. And Airbnb gives some really cute examples of the kind of things that you can do. And I really like this. I think this is something that goes back to my original point that a native app, that the weight of feel that you get with it is a lot down to the delight that you get from interacting with it. And I think these animations are really beautiful. And the fact that we can do those in a hybrid app that we've written in JavaScript and that runs on Android and iOS is absolutely amazing. And we can take Lottie to an extreme that it really wasn't designed to do. But again, it's stuff that designers have made in After Effects and then can run perfectly on iOS and Android. And this is what you see after the loading screen on Dough Universe. And this is in the jungle of one of the planets. And this planet, they've lost, the dough creatures have lost their ability to use light. And you're helping them make some light machines. And this is all from Lottie. So that's a taster of that. You can actually, this is free on the App Store. If you search for it, you'll be able to play with this. But I just think that's a nice example of the level to which you can go with native animations and the things you can achieve that you just wouldn't be able to achieve on web. And these things are not only doable in React Native, but really, really quite easy and quite fun to do. And so that's that from me. And I have, you can kind of go through the examples from this talk on an Expo app that's in that repository and see the slides. So have a go at it. Thank you.
Hello, Jamie. Thank you very much indeed. That was brilliant. Has anyone got any questions for Jamie?
Hi. You mentioned that that Facebook have enabled easing just by default for no real reason. Are there any other kind of random little things that we need to know about before we get into this?
That's one of the ones that really sticks in my mind, because the way Lottie works is it means it plays, if you follow the docs, well, before I made a pull request to change this, it would play all of your animations with easing, which caused us some really interesting problems. That is perhaps the weirdest one. It's a good question. And something that I totally agree with what Joe said is that the developer experience in React Native has got an awful lot better over the last year. I think I first did React Native development about 18 months ago, and it was terrible because 80% of the time was spent having to know stuff like this, having to know which order to clean caches in to get something to restart. On the whole, I think it's improving. Of course, this is something that's probably going to be a breaking change if they change it back, but it's much more standardized. And so, yes, there are things, I'm afraid they don't spring to mind, but they are decreasing by the day.
Hey, other than Lottie, have you got any other recommendations for other libraries and stuff for animation?
Yeah, so if you're interested in doing kind of very basic stuff, which is just say spinning or moving or draggable, that you don't really need that much configurability with, there's a library called React Native Animatable. I think the guy who made that, his GitHub is called Oblador. He also made a really very good library for doing vector icons in React Native. So those are much more declarative than what I've showed you, which is quite imperative. And I guess as a React developer that you would start off being a bit suspicious of. I'm fine with it, obviously. React Native Animatable is much more, you would just say animatable view that spins and it does it. So yeah, I'd recommend that for the more basic stuff.
Great. Any more? Are there any tweening libraries?
Tweening libraries?
You just specify the beginning, the end, and a few points in between them.
Yeah, no, basically. Yeah. It's not that I've come across. Yeah. It's a shame. I guess you get around this by just telling designers to do stuff in After Effects, and then they send you the files. But, yeah.
There you go. With Lottie.
Yeah.
You can do it with start the spraying.
Yeah.
Cool. Any more questions? Good. Okay. Thank you very much, Jamie. It was brilliant. We're going to break for what? Going to break for 10 minutes? 15? 5? Oh. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah. 1, 2, 3. That's fine. Yeah, that's fine.
Recording stopped, so maybe it's
1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Yeah.
so that's still on, yeah.
Try it again.
I think it might be QuickTime.
Let's see, it might be.
Yeah.
Is yours, do you have animations or anything like that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
One, two, three.
Fingers crossed.
Okay.
I think we can.
Right.
There's no.
Yeah, let's try.
I don't. It's not recording the screen.
Let's check the screen, and I think we're ready. So let's go for.
So you need to open it up.
Sorry about this, everybody. We're just having a few problems with the sound.
I'll tell you that. I think we're good now. I think we're good. Turn the microphone up to that's perfect. And record. Drag it so back. And then drag it over there. Oh, it is over there. So press it in that one.
It's mirroring.
Yeah, let's do that one. And then that's done. Perfect. Okay, and do your thing. Then we're good.
Hey, brilliant. Well done. Thank you, Marcus. Thank you, Sarah. Sorry about that. We're having a few problems with feedback. We're going to carry on. Welcome back. This is Zara from Bloomberg. I'm just going to do the last talk. Thank you.
Okay, hi everybody. I hope you've been learning a lot today. So, as Stu just mentioned, I am from Bloomberg, hence the extremely corporate PowerPoint template. I apologize for that. Hopefully you can deal with a lot of Arial for the next 20 minutes to half an hour. So, as might have been given away by this slide, if you've been reading carefully, I am not actually a React Native developer. I usually write native code all day, and you might be thinking, oh no, the square brackets, they're coming. But yeah, that's essentially what this talk is going to be about. So sorry about that. So today I'm here to talk to you a little bit about React Native and how it interfaces with native code. So I know you might be thinking, well, isn't writing like literally no native code the whole point of React Native? I don't want to look at Objective-C. I don't want to look at Java. I'm here to write JavaScript. Well, I think with any computing concept or new framework, I think understanding what happens at least one level beneath, even having a cursory understanding of that, is really important and can really help inform your knowledge of the limitations and abilities that you have with using that framework. So that's what I'm here to talk to you about today. So let's have a look at a sample React Native application, very basic. So say I've written an application which has a ton of functionality, including displaying emoji and some text. So, we've got some very simple code here. We're just rendering some different elements. We're returning a view. We're returning some text labels. So the interesting thing is, like, we're writing this in JavaScript, and as has been mentioned before, this is turning into a bunch of native elements. And, you know, that's kind of cool, but like, we don't really need to know how that works, right? Well, no, you don't. But I think it's really interesting, and it can inform a lot about what happens with the framework, including performance, things you can do. So let's see how we go from this to this. Okay. So what exactly is happening? We know that there's some stuff happening on the native side. So today I'm going to take you through what's happening in iOS when you start to render some different elements. So first things first, we'll talk about the tale of two runtimes. So whenever you run a React Native application, you have the JS runtime, obviously, writing some JavaScript. And you have the native runtime, and technically on Android, it's 3 runtimes, but I'm not going to get into that. So how does it work? Well, you've got the JavaScript realm and the native realm, as I have mentioned. And both of those sides are really fast. They're really good at what they do. They're quite mature, had some really expert developers working on them for years. So we don't have to worry about those too much. The thing is, though, that those can't talk to each other directly. I mean, JavaScript and Java or JavaScript and Objective-C aren't directly interoperable. So we have to deal with these two things working in separate silos. So how do we get from that, from both of them talking to each other? So this happens through, as has been mentioned previously tonight, the bridge. So any information that you want to send from one side to the other, be it native to JS or JS to native, has to pass over this bridge. So how does this actually look in terms of our sample application, which I'm going to show you about 10 more times tonight. So, okay, I'm going to take you through how it works on iOS. It's very similar to how it works on Android as well. So to start off with, we have the two separate runtimes. We have iOS and we have JavaScript. And we want to start up our React Native application. So what happens is that on iOS, we also have the bridge, that'll come in handy. So what happens is on iOS, it wakes up and it essentially says, hey, can you start this application for me, please, JavaScript? We want to run some React Native code. And then JavaScript says, okay, I'm going to run this React Native code. That's what I do. Just here to satisfy all of the web developers who are here to write mobile apps. And we look at the render function next. So we call render, and then it says, okay, there's a few elements. I want to render a view. We want to render a text label and an emoji and another text label too. So now that we have that information from the render function, it goes back over the bridge and basically says, hey, iOS, can you render these things for me, please? 2 text labels, not one. And iOS obliges and says, okay, I'm going to make a UI view, which is the native UI element in iOS, and also a pair of text views as well, and it's going to display them. And anytime you have some sort of interaction between iOS and JavaScript, as I've said, it goes over the bridge. So this is something to bear in mind. So a few interesting things about that. Obviously, as I've said, Objective-C and JavaScript, or Java and JavaScript, aren't interoperable. So we rely on JSON to go over the bridge because that's fairly easy for most programming languages to use, except if you've ever tried to actually decompose some JSON in Java. I can tell you, there's a lot of exception handling. Anyway, additionally, you'll notice that when these messages regarding render and what needs to be rendered came up, they didn't all go one by one over the bridge. That's because these calls are batched. And as we're dealing with a lot of asynchronous programming in JavaScript, this also works asynchronously, which is quite natural for a JavaScript developer, maybe not so much for a native developer. So let's zoom in a little bit into each of these two sides and see what's going on. So let's take a look at the iOS side first. So in the native runtime, there are a few things going on. We run 3 main threads that we care about. So we have the main thread for the UI. This, if you take nothing else away about native programming for mobile today, it's that you do your UI on the main thread, don't do any networking on the main thread. The reason your animations look so buttery smooth is because you're not doing anything else on the main thread that is unnecessary. So that's just one thing to bear in mind. We also have a JavaScript thread, which is where the majority of your business logic and JS execution happens. And then the next one, technically not a thread, but details. And this is where your diffing and layout computation happens. So basically the core sort of layout algorithm of React. And additionally, we'll be talking a little bit about native modules and how you can use them in your code. But just something to bear in mind, each of these has their own queues as well. And as mentioned earlier in the Q&A with Joe, the JavaScript runtime is a JS engine on JavaScript core, which started off as an Objective-C wrapper around WebKit, which is the engine that Safari, the web browser, uses. So this comes for free with Objective-C and iOS. This is how you execute JavaScript in iOS, essentially. And yes, it is a standalone JavaScript execution environment. We're not dealing with any web views, any, sad reminders of the days of Titanium and PhoneGap and what have you. This is what really makes things work really fast and gives you some great performance. And, sorry, just to bear in mind, I've mentioned it's an Objective-C wrapper, but the React Native team have kindly ported this over to Android for us. But as mentioned, this doesn't come for free in Android, so this does add a little bit of weight to your application. I think it's about 3 or 4 megabytes, so not too much. Well, maybe a bit much for 2 text labels in a view, but hey. So you might be thinking, okay, this sounds kind of interesting, but how does this affect me? Like, I'm just going to make a cool React Native app that doesn't really need any native functionality that isn't already implemented. Well, there's something really cool called the message queue class, and it has a function on it called the spy function. And I've been talking about this sort of theoretical bridge or whatever, and it's like, yeah, but that's really deep within the React Native source code, right? I'm never going to deal with that. Well, something really easy you can do to sort of see this in real time and see this happening with your application is to drop these 2 lines of code into your application. So you just import message queue. It's already part of React Native, so no libraries or anything needed. And then anywhere in your JavaScript code, you can basically say message queue.spy true, or you can drop a function in there to do whatever you like with the printing, essentially. But what that basically gives you is when you run your application in debug and you choose to debug your JS remotely, you get something a little bit like this when you run our handy sample application that we've seen before. So you might be thinking, oh no, wall of text. But essentially, taking a little bit of time to read this and decipher it really clears up what's going on when JS and native code are talking to each other. So I apologize if it's a little bit small. There's a lot in there. But on one side, we have an indication of which direction this is going in. So you'll see N to JS on one side, or JS to N. That indicates which side is going to which side is talking to which side. And you'll see a bunch of different things going on here. At the very top, we've got app registry.run application and the name of our app, which is essentially the wake-up call from iOS to JavaScript. And we have a few different things. Here it's mainly JavaScript telling the iOS UI manager to make these native views and display them. So you might be thinking, okay, this is still cool, but like, I'm not going to use this, right? So one thing this can be really handy for is if you have some performance problems, say you're implementing an animation, something that can happen really easily is that you hammer the bridge with a lot of information about your animation. So you're sending consistently points but not if you use animated.value, which I have learned today. But when you're using libraries or implementing animations, this can be a real source of pain when it comes to performance. So this is something that you can quickly use to diagnose those issues. And I think it's just really interesting to watch sometimes. Yes, I do have hobbies other than programming as well. Okay, so we've had a little bit of a talk about that, and you're thinking, okay, theory, theory, theory. What about the practical side of things? So as well as taking this understanding away, I'm going to show you some Objective-C code, and I am really sorry. But essentially, I'm going to take you through a few examples of how if you have an iOS library or some iOS code sitting about, as many JavaScript developers do, I'm sure, how you can integrate that into your React Native application. But in all seriousness, if you do want to use things like, you know, the latest and greatest APIs, so do you want to use a shiny new API on iOS or Android? WWDC is coming up, Google I/O is coming up, they might unveil something really cool and you want to use it, but unfortunately it's not part of React Native yet, then this is something you can do to try and get access to that. Do you want to use a library that requires you to React Native link? This is what's going on with that underneath. So if you run into any issues, hopefully you'll come away feeling a little bit more confident about dealing with those. And if you want to use any functionality that is currently not provided by React Native, or some, you know, very nice person on GitHub who has provided one for you, then this is something you might want to look into. Yeah. So I'm going to start off with just a quick reminder. So Joe mentioned earlier that there are a couple of different ways to make a React Native app from scratch. So you can either use Expo or create React Native app, which are the slightly more sandbox versions and take you one level up from the native code. So in that case, you need to eject. So that means essentially you won't be inside the cozy bubble of building that provides you anymore. You will have to deal with Xcode or Android Studio. They're not as scary as they may seem, I think. But anyway, to get those started and to get them running, at least in a development environment, is generally not too difficult. You can get a free development account for Xcode these days, so you don't have to pay anyone to get it to run on your device anymore. Yay! So that's the case. And if you're using React Native init, then this is already done for you. So the output of either of these steps is essentially that you'll have an iOS folder and an Android folder which are available. And this is what the iOS folder looks like. So this is an Xcode project. It's just a bunch of files. It's not going to eat you, don't worry. So we have a few things going on here. We have the app delegate, which is basically the thing that does all the things in iOS. That's essentially the short description, but essentially that is your launching point for a lot of things. You have some assets. You have this info.plist file, which basically gives you a chance to define a lot of permissions and things like that. And you have some other things. They're not really that important for this presentation. You can go away and look at them if you want. I doubt you will. So, okay. So to use any native methods or modules in our JS code, the first step is to make a bridge. Now, I'm not going to take you through the nitty-gritty of this. I'm just going to tell you that there is this really helpful library or command line tool, whatever you want to call it, by Peggy Razis, which is available on GitHub. It's called React Native Create Bridge. So essentially, you just install this with npm. You run React Native, and then there's a command which I can't remember. I think it's new module. It's all in the README. But essentially, it'll set up some template iOS and JavaScript files for you, where all you have to think about is the implementation of that code that you actually want to include. And we're going to go through a really basic example. So let's say, for example, in my super cool sample app that we have some need to discover what sort of authentication the user is using at the moment. This is a very, very far-fetched example, I will acknowledge. But essentially, this is something that is not too difficult to implement. You can, like, if you wanted to do this yourself, I don't think you even need to understand Objective-C. You can literally copy and paste this off Stack Overflow. But what's going on here? So don't worry, I will explain it. So we have an implementation file for our module. So as is mentioned at the top. So with any Objective-C code that we want to export as a module, we just use this macro, RCT export module. That just means I'm a module, React Native, look at me. And then we have a few options for what we can do. So we can just export a dictionary, which is kind of like JSON. So say you had some constants on your native side that you wanted to export, that is very easy. And then if you want to export a method, that's also fairly easy too. So we have this other macro, RCT export method, which wraps a function. And say we want our module to have this function get biometry type, and it returns a string. So say the user is using face ID, it'll just return a string saying face. If they're using touch ID, it'll return a string saying touch. And if they're not using any sort of biometric authentication, it'll just say there's no biometric authentication. So there is some very interesting biometric authentication checking code that I have literally off the screen. It's about here somewhere, but I'm not going to take you through that at the moment because I'm not here to talk to you about the fine details of the authentication APIs in iOS. Essentially, imagine that we have made a variable called biometric type or biotype, and that we want to return that. All we need to do to get that value from the native side into the JS side at this point is we can use callbacks. So as you can see, my method is called getBiometryType, and it takes an argument here of RCT response sender block, but that's just a really fancy name for a callback, and I've handily labeled it there. So if you just wrap this, so what we have here is we're calling callback. The first parameter is an error, but as we know, this is really bulletproof code that is not going to throw any errors. So we're just going to return a null value for that. And then we just return whatever variable we want to return. We could return a literal. It's very flexible. And then if we wanted to use that in our JS code, all we need to do to call this module is to drop a few lines of code into any of our components or other code that we wanted. So you import the native modules section of React Native. You can then assign it its own variable for convenience, not even necessary. And then you can just use it as you would normally use functions with callbacks in React Native. So we just call that function, we pass in a couple of, we provide a function with two arguments, the error and the type or the result, and then we can use those straight away. So just console log the error if we get an error. Otherwise, we can use it with set state. We can use it wherever we want in our application. You can go wild, do whatever you want. You're all the JavaScript developers, so you probably know better than me. So, okay, so we've done that. And what does this end up looking like? Well, I ran this on the simulator about 3 hours ago, and this is the result. So when I have the simulator mocking touch authentication, I've got it to display touch authentication in this label using a small bit of JavaScript in one of my text views. Otherwise, when I disable touch authentication, I am not using any authentication. And that's basically all of the code I needed to write, bar about 10 lines of Objective-C to get this to work. So it may seem quite intimidating, and I still find Objective-C quite intimidating sometimes. But really, getting from iOS or Android to JavaScript, a lot of the difficulties have been extracted away by, the folks who do open source. So I don't think people should feel constrained by what's available in React Native. Getting started with iOS or Android development within React Native the barriers aren't as high as they used to be, and I think it can be really interesting, especially if you want to use new features. As well as callbacks, we have a couple of other options. So we can use promises. So instead of RCT export method, what we can do is we can return a promise instead if we want to do any asynchronous programming. So this makes using async await possible. It can be much nicer. So I've actually included a little bit of the Objective-C here that you would need to do it. It's about as verbose as Java can be. But essentially what's going on here is that at the top, we provide 2 blocks as our arguments for this function. We've got a resolve block and a reject block. So this line essentially asks the device, can you tell me if this device has any sort of biometric authentication on it? And if it's successful, we're going to do some fun bio-auth checking, Objective-C or Swift type thing there. And essentially, at the end of that, we'll just resolve with the actual authentication method. And if it's not successful, we want to reject it and handle it in our JavaScript code. So that's what you can do there. I'm not going to show you a promise because I'm sure you know what that looks like already. And you might want to do something a little bit different. So instead of using callbacks or promises, you might want to be monitoring for events in iOS or Android. So that's also possible. We can use event emitters instead. So that's a little bit different. So on the actual module level, you have to declare it is an event emitter, as we have done at the top. So this essentially means that our module is subclassing RCT event emitter, which is the module provided by React Native. And then every function inside there essentially can broadcast a message to React Native. So you can set a listener for it in the JavaScript code. So say you want to monitor whether the users changed their fingerprints and you want to wipe some data or something because you can't trust that their fingerprints are the ones registered on the phone anymore. So that's an example of something you might want to do. So if we want to use this in JavaScript, we just need to also import native event emitter, and then we set up a new native event emitter that takes in our module, and we subscribe to it, and I've put the wrong name in there. But imagine that says biometry info emitter. So we can add a listener to our event emitter, and we can check for the name that we have registered in our native code, if it's spelled correctly. Sorry about that. But essentially, it's looking out for an authentication update message from this emitter. And in that case, if we have an update, we're just deciding to console log there, but you can do whatever you like. So say we were doing calendar manager emitter instead. If somebody sent you an invitation and you wanted to display something in your React Native code, that's quite easy to do. You can just add whatever JavaScript you want to do there. And just something to bear in mind is that you want to actually unsubscribe from the events afterwards when you're not using that component anymore. Otherwise, that'll just be left there dangling and impacting a little bit on your application and user experience. So don't do that. And voila, we have imported a little bit of native code into our React Native app. You might be thinking, what just happened? There were so many square brackets. But I hope this kind of goes to show that there's not too much involved in actually adding some native code into your React Native application. Sure, you might want to get a buddy who knows Swift or Objective-C or Java to start to help you out. But I hope this gives you an indication of where to look, not to feel too afraid if you're looking into helping out with an open source React Native project that uses these things and get an error. Essentially, this is the foundation of React Native as much as we may not want to look at it. But I think it can get very interesting to use as well. And just to recap what we've looked at. So today we've looked at the bridge, we've looked at the 2 runtimes or 3 runtimes that make up React Native. We've looked at how to bridge native modules into React Native. I haven't had a chance to cover everything because obviously there is a lot of information here, but 2 important things I think that if you want to go away and look at this a bit more is adding native views to React Native. So as well as adding regular functions, you can build an Objective-C view. Maybe somebody has implemented a really cool charting library in Objective-C and you want to use that in React Native rather than re-implementing it completely. That's something you can do. And also, I have more experience with this, but adding React Native into existing native applications, and that's also quite straightforward. So I would say if you are working at a small company or a company with some existing native applications, maybe you're struggling to hire some native developers, or maybe you don't want to hire any more native developers because everyone keeps talking about square brackets and it's just really getting to you. In that case, if you want to take a look at how you can get some React Native views into your application and maybe get more of your product development team working on it, that's something that's really worth looking at. It's not too difficult to set up, especially if you're using industry practices like, I don't know, using a dependency manager and things like that. So that's something you can definitely look at as well. I have a few links if you care to look at them. Unfortunately, I don't have a link to my slides right now. Hopefully, I'll be able to tweet that out later. But essentially, there are some really interesting articles on how this all works if you are interested. And just to describe them, the first one is the React Native Create Bridge open source project that I mentioned. There is an article by one of the React Native team about how this all really works in depth. And then if you want to have a look at Ray Wenderlich's website, that is essentially very iOS focused, and they have a really interesting article on how to actually get started with mixing and matching, like in a very practical way. So if you do want to take a look at this and try to follow along, that's something to really look at. And thank you very much. And here are some random pictures of our office building that I probably didn't put in there. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. That's great. Thank you very much. Has anybody got any questions?
Hi. You mentioned the square brackets thing, and also you did mention Swift. So are they on a par? Can I write native modules in Swift and get away from square brackets?
Yeah, definitely. So the thing is that with any sort of interoperability things, usually Objective-C handles it a bit better, but you can definitely write it in Swift. I write mainly Swift myself. Objective-C is a little bit foreign to me. So as I mentioned, that open source project, it actually gives you a few options in terms of which languages you want to use. So that you can choose between Swift, Objective-C, Java, and Kotlin, if those are more your thing. Swift and Kotlin are very similar, and they're quite similar to JavaScript, so I think they're quite friendly. I actually gave a talk about a year ago on how similar Swift and JavaScript are, so if that's something you're interested in doing, that's really open to you.
Great, thanks.
Any more questions? Yeah.
Can you hear me? Cool. Feel free to discard it if it's out of scope. I'm just wondering, you said once you eject, you get like 2 different folders, one iOS, one Android, and then you have to build the the bridges for the native modules and so on. So what happens if I try to use that app in Android?
So at the moment, we don't have an Android implementation. So what I would suggest is first you build the Android implementation before you try to use this app. But otherwise, there are things you can do. Like say you had a module that you only wanted to use in iOS, you can quite easily, for any component, I don't think this has been mentioned tonight, but if there are any components that you want to implement in different ways in iOS and Android, you can do that by actually putting your component name .ios.js or .android.js. So say you had this module only available in iOS, you could actually just only use it in the ios.js implementation rather than just putting it in the general component. And that means you don't necessarily have to implement it on both sides if there's no actual equivalent. I don't know what would actually happen if you tried to run this on an Android phone, though. I suspect very little.
Cool. Any others before we go? Okay, great. Thank you very much, Zara. That's great. Thank you very much for coming. If you're still hungry, or your partner or children are hungry, there's lots of pizza at the back, so please help yourself. And if you're still thirsty, then we're going for a drink down here, so with the Angel across the road. So thank you very much for coming. Hopefully see you at the React meetup or at the We Love Tech meetup. Speak to you soon. Thank you.